Good afternoon and welcome to our afternoon festivities. With us we have Professor Gordon Rohlehr. He's the author of several books on different aspects of Caribbean culture. He spent around 40 years in the Department of English here at the UE, and he's established an international reputation for his groundbreaking work on Caribbean literature, calypso, and culture. He's the world's leading authority on calypso, tracing its development over the last 200 years from its West African origins and studying the vast amount of recorded material produced by generations of West Indians, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago. Today, he is going to talk to us about his memoir that has been longlisted for the OCM Bocas Lit Fest Prize for Caribbean Literature, Musings, Mazes, Muses, Margins. Over to you, Prof. Rohlehr.
First, I must say thanks to Muley and the department. I haven't been in this situation for a long time. In fact, I've never been in this situation. And I want to talk about this text, Musings, Mazes, Muses, and Margins. And the publisher has added another M, a memoir. This text, it's only after these things were put together that it began to look like a text and to challenge the reader to find in it a coherent narrative. But Musings, Mazes, Muses, and Margins, how did it begin? It began when Jean Antoine Donne asked me to do an address on metaphors and symbols. And this address was to be delivered at a symposium in honor of Father Michel de Vertaille, very good friend of mine. Father de Vertaille had, I don't know if he had devised, but he had developed a way of reading the Bible as an ongoing narrative and the metaphor of, well, of existence. He'd find narratives in just about anything. And what I did when she asked me to do this was to ask myself whether I couldn't use my own experiences and view my own life as a metaphor of something or other, and read my life in the way that Father Michel read the Bible. That's a tall order, strange order. But that's how the first chapter of the book, the Chronicles of Daniel, began. Now, why the Chronicles of Daniel? Well, my parents gave me 3 Christian names, Daniel, Frederick, and Gordon, but called me Gordon. All my life I've been known as Gordon. I discovered in time, though, that when I was asked by mainly immigration officers, passport departments, and so on. What was my first name? Monks. And I said, well, Gordon. They said, no, Gordon is not your first name. Your first name is the name that appears on your passport. And my first name on the passport was Daniel. So I began to ask myself, who was this fellow Daniel? Where did the name come from? What did it signify? And then, having done that, I asked myself, who was Frederick? Because the passport officer told me my middle name was Frederick. So the real problem became the identification, not of Daniel and Frederick, but the identification of Gordon. And it appeared that Gordon was quite irrelevant to the process. He was not the first name, he was not the middle name, and there was no room on the passport form for a third name. So Gordon, the name by which I was most unknown, became left out of the equation. So that's how it began. So I wrote the Chronicles of Daniel, and I decided that I would include all my names, Daniel, Frederick, and Gordon. Some people who saw the manuscript accused me of having a multiple personality disorder. And I didn't agree with them. For me, it was a narrating device. And I termed these three personalities I and I and I, following really the Rastafari terminology, I and I. Instead of saying we, they would say I and I. So I and I and I. I also was inspired to do this by a little known play that had been written by Victor Kettel in the mid-1970s called The Doctor He Dead, in which he represented Eric Williams as three people. Eric, I think Eustace, and the Doc. And the Doc is a psychiatrist who is required to solve all the mental problems of the society. And in front of him in his office appears a young man called Basil Davis, who everybody would know was involved in the 1970. He was one of the people killed, actually, the first person killed in 1970. He had a huge funeral. So Basil Davis has this problem which he's bringing to the Doc, but he has to get past Eustace and he has to get past Eric before he can get to the Doc. When he does get to the Doc, for the first thing he says is the concrete doctor. It's all the concrete. Somehow the city itself, as a kind of inhumane place, is what he thinks has sent him off. Anyhow, I thought this was a nice idea. I don't think Victor could have sustained that that idea, but those three personalities struck me. So I think they influenced my presenting the narrators of this book as I and I and I. And I also call them all three I. And I play with the idea of the Trinity a lot. Now, so let me, so you can see you're in a lot of trouble. You're in a lot of trouble. So I can start reading from the book, the first of the Chronicles of Daniel. And I call it 6 Parables of Disconnection. And that's another thing, because the entire book is about disconnection, about my disconnecting from places and issues and sometimes people. The main place would be the University of the West Indies, where I spent 40, I call them sacrimonious years. But I enjoyed my stay here. But I had to disconnect, and there were problems about the disconnection. But I also disconnected quite early, I think, from the church, at least the Anglican church, the religious arrangement or explanation of life. And that's a theme that runs through the book. There's that kind of disconnection. In fact, I discovered that Father Michel had himself begun to disconnect from reality. Amnesia was setting in. And so there is this figure running throughout the Chronicles of the disconnected priest or preacher, the preacher who is disconnected from his congregation for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes these reasons might have been cultural. So let me begin, having gotten through that part of it. I, Daniel Lyons-Den, no, that's another thing, Lyons-Den, because I always found myself in these strange and difficult situations. So I thought I was Daniel in the Lion's Den, but I create a name, Lyons, Lyons, Den, D-E-N-N-E. And in fact, when I checked it in the computer, such a name is quite possible. I, Daniel Lyons-Den, dreamer and uncertain interpreter of forgotten dreams, named after both a mighty lion tamer, firewalker, and prophet of the crumble of empires, and my father's father, a roisterous red rooster and madhouse administrator who loved rum and women in perhaps equal measure, was born with a call and used as a child to see things, shapes, shades, forms, images, spirits that no one else seemed to see. No one paid too much attention to this tendency of mine until I started naming and identifying herbs and plants that I said were to be used for healing. My instructions were precise. Specific leaves, buds, and stems were to be boiled and then served in a clean, new calabash. This new phase in my seeing posed a problem to the elders of my tribe. To obey the boy was to recognize that his spiritual authority was greater than Grandmother Julia's or that of her sisters, Nana Babs. To ignore the boy was to remain ignorant of what might possibly be useful herb lore, because my Aunt Zinnia used to say, all bush good, although we may not know what it's good for. So what were they to do with this Obia child of call and precocious calling? What did they do? I asked my mother, a staunch yet scathingly skeptical Anglican, who, having grown up in the friendlier Scots Presbyterian Church, had never really liked those Anglicans. She once told me that though our family had been attending St. James the more or less in Pitty Village for nearly 50 years, only once had an Anglican vicar, the Venerable Canon Wormwood Spears, set foot in our house. What did they do? I asked her again. They must have done something, because I haven't seen anything extraordinary for 6 decades. She was 95 at the time. Her brain a 3-pronged plug with one pin grounded in the neuter present, while the other 2 crackled with the positive and negative currents of the now perfected fables of the past. They put out your eye, she replied. Who are they? I asked. The elders, the older women in your father's Obia family. They didn't want any seer man in the family. They said there were already too many madmen on parade, so they put out your eye. Okay, well, how did they put it out? They used steam, my mother said, adding that she didn't think it was a good thing to interfere with a person's gift of vision. She didn't think so, but she didn't, maybe couldn't, stop them from performing their exorcism. This humility on my mother's part was inexplicable. My mother was a woman intelligent enough to have won a gold medal for placing fourth in the College of Preceptors examinations for Commonwealth students. Tough enough as a child to have survived the race and class prejudice of Bishop's High School, whose rulers denied her a place, even though she, poor and black as she was, had beaten all comers in the government committee scholarship examinations of 1920 or 1921. I had always known her to be powerfully articulate and strong in the expression of her opinions. Indeed, she still was at 95, when her judgments, after so many decades of weathering, had hardened into inflexibility. Yet my mother seemed to have been voiceless and powerless before this conclave, maybe coven, of divining elder women on their mission to steam the vision out of my third eye. What happened after they steamed out my eye? I asked my mother. Well, you no longer told us your dreams, she replied. You used to dream and tell us your dreams, and we would know what was happening or what would happen. But after they shut your eye, you no longer told us your dreams. My reticent, self-absorbed father, the big H, probably didn't know or couldn't care less about what was going on. His most likely response to such mumbo jumbo would have been a deep, dark stoops and a retreat to the sanity of the day's crossword puzzle in the Argosy, which he would fill out while reclining in a hammock that he had slung in the middle of the living room. Thus began my disconnection. The elders, priestesses of a spiritual lore that had survived beneath and beyond the colonial overburden of Anglicanism, Methodism, and Presbyterianism, had decided that the generations after them were to travel unimpeded along the road of what Walcott called a sound colonial education. And that the heat, and that the best way to ensure this was to close off any alternative dark modes of knowing, to install rather than open, as Legba used to do, the barriers to ancestral consciousness, to drive a first vision to such a deep, distant, and desolate place that it would become virtually irretrievable. Those gray keepers of the remnants of dark lore had grown scared or apprehensive about the continuity into a new age of their own ancestral line of vision. So out of love and dread, they buried my eye and theirs deep beneath the roots of a komaka tree, as they had 5 years earlier buried my navel string between the sweet sapodilla and sour orange trees in our backyard at Adelphi, that village of lost oracles. And so I dreamed through my childhood, a white, moist mist of steam blurring my dreaming eye, erasing memory of each dream and face and name as I awakened every morning, drifting from one sleep into another. Now, the second section of the chronicle is called The Hot Sun of Outer Darkness. Now, I've already introduced you to Daniel, part-time dreamer and interpreter of dreams, severed from EYE and I, from I, and ancestor. I must now introduce you to Frederick, my second name, given to me to preserve a link to my pale Teutonic great-great-grandfather. You didn't think I had that, eh? The ironically named Schwartz, i.e. brown, i.e. black, dark, lion's den, an obscure Austrian refugee who during the age of Bismarck escaped from a war, maybe the Austro-Prussian or the Prusso-Austrian War, that had already devoured his 6 older brothers. Smuggled out of Austria by his grieving and defiant mother, one of my 16 great-great-great-grandmothers, this 7th son of a Hun embarked on a journey of disconnection that took him to Holland, then Suriname, then Albion Berbice, British Guyana, where he became the fertile founder of my father's tribe. My great-grandfather, William, the shoemaker, was probably one of Schwartz's swarthy sons, the apparently unacknowledged fruit of his fornication. My great-uncle Fred, who they say was not too right in his head, was Schwartz's grandson, as was my grandfather Daniel Alexander. Frederick is a reticent fellow. His name derives from German Fried, F-R-I-D, meaning peaceful, and Rich, R-I-C, meaning ruler. And I suppose Frederick, about whom little is known, has silently retreated to his zone of peace, somewhere at the center of the vortex of my life. If Frederick rules a kingdom, it has to be one that he has constructed secretly and with his own hands. Great-great-grandfather Schwartz, who they say became owner or manager of Albion Sugar Estate, made sure that very little of his fortune filtered down to my tendril of the family tree. Nothing for William, his unacknowledged son, and my great-grandfather, Nothing for Daniel, his grandson, keeper of the National Madhouse, and my grandfather, or Fred, my great uncle, who was or ought, they say, to have been domiciled in that asylum. There was consequently nothing for Herman, the big H, my father, and not for I and I and I. Peaceful Frederick inherited no kingdom. Frederick is my middle name. I should suppose also introduce you to Gordon. My third name and the one by which I am best unknown. Gordon did not derive from the manufacture of that famous gin, as I was once proud to relate, but was one of the names of my mother's father, Cato Gordon, or Gordon Cato, who, rising from mule boy to manager of Bel Air Estate, planted the conversation tree and presided over the digging of the now mud and lotus clogged 40-foot deep canal. Daniel, keeper of the madhouse, lover of rum and women, dreams but can't remember his own dreams. Tells when intoxicated on sweet Eldorado rum and bitter Gordon's gin, ribald and incredible tales about his youthful escapades and conquests. Frederick rules peacefully in some remote impoverished kingdom of mind and spirit, avoiding the mess of things, looking on like Joseph Conrad's Axel Heist and making no sound. Gordon, on the other hand, though numbed and inhibited by his dreaming and introverted brethren, shovels spadefuls of dense and at times putrid mud to dig canals that go nowhere and will in time become clogged once more with mud. Garbage, rusty pipes, old tin cups, and incongruously delicate and beautiful pink water lilies. Armed with three such identities, three personae, but one Gordonian voice, I was trebly reinforced, or so they must have thought, against the principalities, powers, and workers of iniquity, the purple traitors, and Zinnia termed them, that prowled the land in those times, and which have survived to inspire all the wickedness in high and low places in these times. I, Daniel, the child, straining my 2 weak surviving eyes to read the blackboard's tangle of words, figures, and diagrams, steam and stew and marinate in the galvanized fiery furnace of St. Jude the Obscure, a wooden Anglican school perched on squat concrete pillars on the sand-covered clay of Muddy, a quiet, dusty village on the Deadwater coast. Next to the school, beyond the gray gat-toothed Wallaba wood paling fence, is the huge, ochre-tinted, jumbie-infested manse, beneath which there is the small, whitewashed, ill-lit Chapel Perilous. Lurking in the recesses of the manse is a short, irascible, prune-faced duppy, Canon Winchester Springfield, a black vicar, and his tall, vague, misty, distant, pale-skinned zombie wife. Did he reduce her to zombie, or she him to duppy? Or had they both, like the three weird Coates sisters, as their citron became reduced to a dust-clogged wreck and their great house, slowly but surely founded on the sands of adventure, simply wasted away on the dead, peaceful Deadwater coast, sandwiched between Essequibo's wide, yawning, 19 miles wide estuary and dense, red howling, baboon barking forests, where there was absolutely no social life to sustain genteel tastes. I, Daniel Lyons-Den, and the other pupils of St. Jude Obscure may be seen attending chapel one morning each week in Lent. When we pray to God, it was we had to say that prayer every morning in Lent. So the prayer went, Almighty and everlasting God, who hatest nothing that thou hast made, and dost forgive the sins of all them that are penitent. Create and make in us new and contrite hearts, that we, worthily lamenting our sins and acknowledging our wretchedness, may obtain of thee, the God of all mercy, perfect remission and forgiveness through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So we had to say that prayer, and we said it so many times that I remembered it. So we had to go to the chapel one morning each week in Lent, where we prayed God to create and make in us new and contrite hearts. And with some effort, we wordily lamented sins we had never yet learned to savor, and acknowledge a wretchedness that we will not until much later recognize as having been such. The sermons listened to without being understood, the prayers learned by rote, the discipline of silence endured in the chapel perilous, will shape us for the rest of our wool-gathering lives. This morning, the sermon is about forgiveness. The triple-barreled Right Reverend Canon Winchester Springfield waxes warm and lengthily on the theme. Boys, he said, especially are the targets of his beady chicken hawk's eyes and his rasping bronchitic eloquence. Boys must not settle their differences with fights and cuss-outs, as is the custom. Say amen, barked he. Amen, barked we. Boys must forgive each other 70 times 7, which is what the Lord commanded. Say amen. Amen. We are then ordered to bow our heads in prayer, whereupon my friend Kenrick mutters loud enough for me to hear, "Oh Lord, please forgive Gordon his sins. He does cough me up and he does cuss me up in school. I try hard but cannot suppress the terrible laughter welling up inside me, which comes out as a sort of aborted chuckle or a strangled crackle. Loud enough, I fear, for the prune-faced gremlin Winchester Springfield to hear, and spin around from the altar where he has been muttering spells and incantations to the drumbeats in his head and guzzling down a silver chalice of something darkly red. He is in time to capture the mirth of life that has spread all over my face. Mirth that has no place in the sanctuary. Kendrick's face is, by contrast, solemn as Prince Buster's Judge Dredd, rudest of all the rude boys. Springfield explodes. You, outside. I cast you into outer darkness. My first thought is that I have let down my mother, Alicia Lyons-Den, who is the deputy sheriff of the jailhouse of St. Jude the Obscure. Deeply ashamed, embarrassed, and fearful of the dire castigation that I knew was going to fall on me, I, Daniel, excommunicated even before I have been communicated, leave the half-light of the Chapel Perilous with its discordant piano plunked by Doris Dolly, an earnest, devoted, and kind dwarf lady, and its pews and whitewashed wooden sepulchral walls runneled by wood ants for the blazing hot sunlight of outer darkness. It is 10 in the morning, and the sun is carrying on something fierce, and the sand is as fiery as the furnace into which they had thrown my brethren, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, millennia ago, in those terrible days when my vision was still clear and pristine, and my prophecies terrible and dreadful. I feel, apart from shame and embarrassment, a certain confusion as I note that Canon Winchester Springfield, a cleric whose irascibility is untempered by even the smallest drop of the milk of human kindness, has preached forgiveness, has ordered us boys to forgive each other, but has not forgiven me the trespass of my smothered laughter in the sanctuary. I also feel anger and distance and resentment, emotions that even at this green age I have learned to conceal, knowing from painful experience that to show such bad feelings is to invite even more dreadful punishment, licks on top of licks. So one learned from early to evade licks. One knew instinctively that social hypocrisy and self-concealment were vital for survival, and one learned not to forgive. These were the deepest lessons of elementary school and the Chapel Perilous. One also learned the truth that Mark Twain once affirmed: there is no humor in heaven. No. The third of these chronicles introduces us to Ashimach. Thus eyeless, now outcast, disconnected, but having inherited my mother's intelligence and skepticism and my father's sardonic detachment, I, Daniel, learned early to walk brightly in darkness, concealing both laughter and the resentment that sometimes fueled laughter. Over the course of 5 years at St. Jude the Obscure, I developed a capacity for what my mother called civil rudeness, which had to be beaten out of me. I also learned, after I embarrassed Ashimach, so I thought, mad headmaster, by demonstrating to the scholarship class where he had erred in working out a problem in arithmetic, that I lacked tact, and tact would have to be beaten into me. Out of or into licks were the approved tonic. Most of us did everything we could to avoid licks, but some of us just couldn't spell correctly, and others had problems learning tables from 2 times 1 to 12 times 19. While others throughout their school life never learned how to convert pounds, shillings, and pence into dollars and cents, or fractions into decimals. The lives of these hard-headed ones were constantly awash with licks. Most of us learned early that it was wise to show penitence and at least pretend that the stinging black sage, wild cane, tamarind, and guava rods, for even Katas was ital in those days, had reduced us to tears. Yet even such crying needed to be judiciously performed. Any suspicion that one was putting on an act would simply inspire more and bitter and hotter licks. It was equally unwise to pretend that the licks were having no effect. This would unmask the futility and absurdity of the entire operation and bring out the mad violence that seemed to lie at the core of even the gentlest teachers. Laughing Man was our hero and fool. He used to laugh whenever he got licks. For years, no one could say they had ever seen him cry, until one day, stumbling between 7 times 13 and 11 times 17, he awakened the madness in Ashimak by laughing during the corrective shower of licks that the good headmaster had begun to rain on his back and backside. That day, Ashimak decided that he would make Laughing Man cry. It took some time and 3 black sage rods, but Ashimak succeeded. Laughing Man did cry. We were demoralized because he was in our way. He was, in a way, our only champion against licks. I sometimes wonder who was sicker, more mad, the sadist or the masochist. I also wonder whether those beatings he received in school were not responsible for how Laughing Man turned out in years later when he and Manik were convicted and jailed for raping Lizzie White Mice. Having shown no tact when I embarrassed Ashimak over that business of the arithmetic sum, I had placed my life in danger. It was only a matter of time before I'd get my share of licks, and Ashimak didn't have to create the opportunity. I virtually delivered myself into his claws one afternoon when I hit Ivan over his right eye with a stick, causing his face to swell frighteningly, or it might have been the morning when I slapped Nini Bahadur Balkaran Singh for insulting my little sister Isis. It was possibly the latter event, because I can still hear Nini's voice ringing triumphantly between her sobs. I go and tell Teach. Teach was my mother, the deputy sheriff, the justice of first resort, to whom all of my misdemeanors were immediately reported. Nini prepared to relish the spectacle of my being punished on her behalf by my own mother. She got better than she hoped for when my mother, her face grim with embarrassment, disgust, and anger, told me to go and tell Mr. Ashimak what you did. She had taught me at home that a boy that hits a girl is a coward. Fighting was taboo, striking girls worse than that. Verbal violence in the form of fiercely traded tantalize was the normal refuge boys would adopt when when confronted by the fierce young warrior women of St. Jude the Obscure, whose tongues, nurtured in the venom of countless backyard quarrels, were sharper and more poisonous than a labaria bite. There were, however, situations when tantalized battles would lead to physical fights. And one such situation was when anyone, boy or girl, mentioned the mother or sister of an antagonist in their tirade of insults. Worst of all were the obscene allusions to their genitals, real or supposed sexual deviance, questionable hygiene, and the like, the stock in trade of backyard and barrackyard encounters. The code of the schoolyard made it imperative for boys to defend the honor of their mothers and sisters with preferably spontaneous blows. If hitting a girl was an act of cowardice, refusal to repay certain types of insult with violence was, according to the schoolyard code, worse than cowardice. When Nini insulted Isis, she had placed me in a monkey pass, a dilemma beyond any tact I'd yet learned. I walked up the central corridor of St. Jude the Obscure, aware of the gauntlet of eyes following my progress, and climbed the creaking stairs to the elevated stage at whose turbulent center was Ashimak's table, with its copybooks, school bell, registers of presences and absences, boxes of chalk, and sacred rods of black sage, tamarind, and most precious and holiest of all, wild cane. I couldn't tell him about the Nigayar tantalized war that I'd had with Nini and how it had culminated in that slap. That would have made him mad. As it was, the beating I received after he heard the censored version of what had happened was mild in comparison to the assault and battery that he had delivered a few weeks previously on the body of Laughing Man. There were perhaps limits to the extent that he would go with the deputy sheriff's son, even when it was the deputy sheriff who had delivered her son into his tender mercies. Yet the licks were real. Ashimak had a heavy arm and was accurate in his delivery. It was painful to ascend to center stage, to be thrashed before the whole school. I slobbered with embarrassment, voting there and then never to speak to Nini again. And having learned from Canon Winchester Springfield and the schoolyard code never to forgive, considered what vengeance I could visit on Ashimak. My opportunity came during lunchtime, when, as usual, I ate in the vicinity where my mother, Ashimak, and one or two other teachers ate. I would then take all of the teachers' plates and cutlery to the well in the schoolyard and wash them, using lime leaves to cut the grease. After that chore, I was free to play. That day, I reasoned that Ashimak couldn't expect that after he had punished me in front of the entire school, I would then wash his plates for him. As far as I was concerned, I was done with granting favors to my persecutors. So I washed all the other plates and left him to get his own washed however he could. I felt that I'd evened the score somewhat and ran out into the schoolyard to play, ignoring the triumphant Nini and her small circle of admirers. There was no safe way of getting back at Nini in the immediate future, and tact demanded that I said nothing about the little victory I just won against Ashi. I was to learn, however, that I had again fallen short in tact. When my mother summoned me before her own dreadful assizes that afternoon after school, she said I had shamed her twice in one day. First, by the offense I had committed, and second, by my retaliation to the licks I had justly received from Ashimak. She deplored a nasty streak of resentment I had so openly displayed by not washing Ashimac's mackerel-scented plates, and spoke of her dismay that I had become so advanced in hardness and guile that I was now exhibiting civil rudeness. She then gained her own catharsis by delivering a triple dose of licks on my already sore backside. One to purge me of the cowardice of striking a girl, even such a sweet, innocent one as Nini Bahadur Balkaran Singh, who had done me nothing. The second, to teach me to accept just punishment with humility and gratitude. The third, to warn me that tact and civil rudeness were quite different things. I thought my mother wrong about Nini, but as I said above, could not dare repeat the nasty details of the quarrel that had triggered the whole affair. I tried to understand what had happened between Nini and myself. Now, we had entered St. Jude the same year and had been, if not great friends, at least tolerant and respectful colleagues. Things changed, however, as we both entered scholarship class, when a deadly rivalry sprang up between us as leaders of respective tribes, races, and genders. So fierce was the spirit of competitiveness that the bitterness of the divide between us deepened when I won a full government county scholarship in 1953, as my brother had done in 1950, and ISIS was to do in 1955. Nini had failed to qualify for even the list of also rans. That day when Ashimac declared a half holiday, which he said would be called Gordon's holiday, Nini let out a bitter, sour stoops, which was sweet honey to my ears, and muttered something stink between what sounded like what I indeed hoped was the gurgle of held back tears. It had been long in coming, but this was revenge beyond expectation, balancing out Nini's triumph on that gray day of my humiliation before the entire school. Those were some of the lessons I learned at St. Jude Obscure, where my very first encounter with Ashimac took place when I was 4.5 years old. I had already learned to count and say the alphabet from listening to Godfrey and Gloria, the first two Lions Den children. I was the third and eager to join my brethren, my brother and sister, in what I did not yet know was a combination of jail and madhouse. So one morning, Aunt Zinnia dressed me up and my mother took me to school. That day, Ashimac was in one of his mad moods. I would learn to read the signs and symptoms of his lunacy as I progressed through school, from Lil ABC to the sacred and scared scholarship class, a congregation of geniuses whose school day was bounded by lessons before school call and after school over. A few of these geniuses indeed, like the malicious Nini, sometimes attended night lessons at Ashimac's home in Adventure. Signs of lunacy: 1, Ashimac's red eyes, moist with Kakapool rum. 2, Ashimac's white drill suit and shirt impeccably starched and ironed by the Arawak woman, who, it was rumored, had been deputizing for his distant wife. Past sufferers of Ashimac's lickings had etched a cartoon figure of a pregnant woman into the wooden boards beneath the stage with the caption, "Ashimac loves Jonathan's mother. She has a child for him." To read that piece of news, and it was accurate, one had to duck under the school, which stood on 3 to 4 foot pillars, except for the stage, which was 7 or more feet from the ground. Perhaps things like that cartoon were forms of uncivil rudeness, acts of subversion by which the powerless sought to reduce the stature and image of their oppressors. They said to Ashimac, "Sir, we know your game. When you whip the plumpest girls across their burgeoning backsides, we understand many things that are not officially on the curriculum of St. Jude the Obscure. Massa, headmaster, we know you. The Arawak woman had 3 sons, including Jonathan, and 1 daughter in St. Jude's. Things were quite complicated on the Deadwater coast, a place that could drive unwary or morally weak outsiders loco. We children, powerless and victimized, read tyrants like Ashimac closely for the signs and symptoms of madness, one of which was the missionary zeal with which he sometimes sought to atone for his own transgression by straightening out the entire school. The morning of my first encounter with the school was one of these days of straightening out. The process commenced after prayers with Ashimac's declaration that he was going to quiz the entire school from standard 2 to standard 6. Questions, as I later realized, were taken from an exercise in Ballard's fundamental English named absurdities. Absurdities required that the student required the student to detect what was absurd or incongruous in a series of statements or propositions. The absurdity of absurdities lay in the fact that few of the students knew the word absurd, even though that word was the most accurate definition of their existence. Ashimac's unique style of asking stupid questions involved choosing a scapegoat, the dunciest child in, say, standard 4, and asking him or her a question that he or she would be unable to answer correctly. He would then pose the same question to the brightest child in standard 3. Woe betide the standard 4 child if the standard 3 child gave the correct answer. Licks, katas for the child, catharsis for the liquor. I observed this mad behavior on my first day, and despite my long acquaintance with tyrants and madhouses, I, Daniel Lyons, then knew there and then that school was not for me. At 10 o'clock break, I lit out like Huck Finn, leaving the schoolyard and hitching a ride homeward on the first donkey cart headed in that direction. I explained to Aunt Zinnia that I had seen Ashimac beating from left to right and from right to left. Blurred as my third eye was, I could still recognize the dreadful omens written on the wall. Time out.
I think that everyone will agree that was an absolutely fantastic hour that we just spent with Prof. All three of them, all three versions, it's been absolutely wonderful. I absolutely recommend that you go and get this book. It's definitely worth reading. And we thank you, Prof, for sharing that with us. It was very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm only sorry that I couldn't I couldn't reveal more. Can't I get 5 minutes to read a little piece?
You can have another 5 minutes, yes.
I'll tell you why. This little piece was written after I left, after I retired, and we used to walk, my wife and I, around the UWI every morning or most mornings, and we took to walking in what I call the cage. And the cage was a car park, the one that runs parallel to the Agostini Street, Curab. Along, we walked up and down in the cage. And well, walking in the cage from 5:30, the cage had day clean. It is 8 a.m. We have walked in UWI's cage of a car park that edges Curep's bizarre border of houses. Some old style, others new, some renovated to capture poor students seeking accommodation. All shaped to fit into squares, oblongs, triangles of tired land, tightly jammed together, painted brightly, red, orange, gray, green, and blues. We walked from 5:30 to 6:30 in the cage, along with parrot toe, knock knee, long leg, short leg, hip hip hooray, sore foot, ho chow min, and the flower stealers, strippers of blossoms that are offered in pujas to avert or invoke doom and judgment and to attract prosperity under Kam Kali Mai's royal heaven. Showered and breakfasted, I am now here in Arima at Brother R. Shelton's Auto Fix It to fix my recalcitrant air conditioner that's filthy of filter and responsible, I'm sure, for my lung condition and now permanent chest cold, my idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, to call a thing by its proper Greek and Latin name. The last time I was here some years ago with the now dead and departed Peugeot 6499, there was a woman who told me her story, thinking I looked like someone who would listen. She told me first about her father, then about her man, the constant jamming she endured with desire, hatred, scorn, and yet more desire. Her name, she said, was Jamania Rawanbali. She lived in Chaguanas. She gave me her number, saying she hoped I'd call sometime, thinking perhaps I was as mad as she. What happened to her, I wonder? I wouldn't remember or recognize her if I saw her today. She said she loved her man, but would give him a hard time, subject him to verbal abuse, reduce him to tears. Her man, like her father, who had never respected her, seemed to need sex constantly. She liked it too, but sometimes wanted to be by herself and would become angry when he demanded, then asked, then begged, then implored. That's when the cussing and the tears, her cussing and his tears, started. She told me the silent bookman, all this just so. She had had something like a breakdown, a descent into depression, needed to talk, I guess, to a gray, neuter, unjudgmental grandfather who could tell, might have his own needs and a few blue notes to spare, needed to talk to me. Me?